So I will introduce Nedra Robinson. She is an early childhood program manager at Simpson Housing Services, where she works with young parents experiencing homelessness. Nedra holds a master's degree in early childhood education from Concordia University. Nedra is a member of the Coalition Executive Committee, and she consults and trains extensively on topics regarding early childhood education, multicultural education, diversity, trauma, and cultural issues. Nedra has agreed to kick off the training series, and we are extremely grateful for her leadership and willingness to share her expertise. So I'm going to hand it over to Nedra. Oh, I think you're on mute.
Okay, I'm going to get started and share my screen, so please let me know if you're able to see that.
We are.
All righty, so we'll go ahead and get started here. Get started. Okay, all right. I'm Nedra, as she said, and I'm kind of excited to be able to start off this training series because I know how very important it is when we're working with families and with children, and that we need to make sure that we are providing culturally responsive home visiting. And whenever we talk about race and implicit bias or unconscious bias, and I will probably use implicit bias more than unconscious bias, and all those things around it, it's really a very complex conversation. People are at different places. We've had different experiences. We all come from a different background, but it all starts with us in terms of us being a cultural being. So we're going to talk briefly, because we just have a little bit of time here. We're going to talk about our being culturally responsive in terms of home visiting. We're also going to talk about ourselves as cultural beings and what that means when we talk about implicit and unconscious bias. I'd like for you to make this conversation. If you have questions, if you want to say anything, want to add to the conversation, please just jump in. And Laura, if you can kind of help me navigate that, because I won't be able to see everyone. So if you'd be able to help me do that, I would appreciate it. So I always like to start out just to ground myself and everyone else into why we're doing this. And we know that what happens in early childhood can matter for a lifetime. That's why we do what we do. So we know that home visiting is one of those things that can make a difference in what happens to a child in their early years. I like to think, let's see if this is going to work for me like I want it to. I like to think that there's a difference between visiting a home and a home visit. And that's where I always like to start, that what the work that we do is different from this just visiting a home. And among some of the things that make a difference, like we plan in advance, we plan for a period of time, we plan activities and discussions, but we also have to think about the difference of how we enter into someone's home and how we communicate with them so we can build that healthy relationship. And that's that part that's important to us in terms of being culturally responsive. First and most important, relationships are recognized as that cornerstone of home visiting. Everything needs to be built around that. But in order for us to be able to have really healthy relationships with the families and children that we're working with, we need to make sure that our services are culturally responsive and that we are delivering those services in a culturally competent way and a culturally respectful way. And that's all the pieces that we are going to be talking about throughout our training series, and how we can make sure that we are entering a home in that way. When you think about it, home visiting actually deals with just the fundamental beliefs of how a parent interacts with their child. That's pretty intimate when you think about what we do. I mean, we're dealing with how a family, how parents actually, what they actually believe in how they should be interacting with their child and with their children. So all of these beliefs are culturally bound, just like parenting practice are culturally bound. They're cultural. And so for us not to be culturally responsive kind of defeats the purpose of what we want to do in the first place. So when we are culturally responsive, and when we're conducting our home visiting services, it communicates to that family, first of all, respect, which is huge to me. And it also communicates that we really have a genuine interest in who they are. We have a genuine interest in their heritage and also their lived experiences. So we have to start with that foundation of culture. And so I'm just going to take a little bit of time, and we're going to have a discussion on that. So we will have time to do the breakout floor. So culture is our familiar. It's who we are. It's the framework which guides our behavior. It guides our lifestyles, the decisions that we make. It's the lens that we understand the world. It's the lens in how we navigate through that world. It actually is that framework which filters and checks what we do on a daily basis. I like to say that it's who we are, whose we are, and where we come from, because it's the context of how we communicate and understand rules and expectations with our families and also with our community. It's the foundation for children's understanding of the world, and it also is how they actually learn. And if we think about culture in a way in terms of families, it's the elements of culture are passed down. They're passed down, we keep some, we throw some away, but the elements of culture are passed down from one generation to the next. And so there's some things that are consistent. If we think about our values and beliefs and some of our ways of knowing of how we understand life, those can be consistent. But it's also dynamic in that it gets reworked every time we get new information about people, or we have new life experiences, or we get new perspectives. So it's dynamic in the sense that it's always changing for us, but then there's that piece of those values and beliefs that are pretty constant. If we think about culture in the ways of new babies, so let's say there's two babies that were born same day, almost the same time, but in two different places. How those babies are going to respond to physical and social stimulus can be very different, even though that they're born at the same time. How their family embraces them, how their family's culture surrounds them can make a big difference in something like, are they going to smile at a stranger, or are they going to be taught only to smile at certain times? So all of that is that who we are and whose we are and where we come from. We can look at how parents tell a child, okay, this is when you're being good. This is when you're being the way I want you to be versus the way I don't want you to be. And that can be very different too. Some parents really want their children to be curious and be out there and see what's in the world where others may not. So culture is that foundation that we have, and we are all cultural beings. So when we think about things like implicit bias, when we think about racism, all of that, this is that foundation that everything is set on. So being culturally responsive as a home visitor, that will incorporate that family's culture into our visits. So it's not going to be just about us and what we see and what we feel and what we do, but we want to incorporate that family's culture into our home visits. And we want to see that as a strength and an influence in parenting. So if we can, Laura, not quite yet, I want to tell them what we're going to do. I want us to take some time to think about ourselves today, because this is where it all begins when we're thinking about all of implicit bias. I'd like for you, we're going to do some breakouts just for maybe 8 to 10 minutes. I think we have time for. We should have time for at least 10 minutes so everybody can share. So I'd like for you to share with your group something that represents your culture to you. Because everyone has cultures. So I want you to think about something that represents that to you. And then what makes you proud? What about who you are, whose you are, and where you come from makes you proud? And then the last thing is, what's that one thing that people believe about your culture that's just not true? Because that happens too. It's like people think we know, but we don't always know. So something that represents you, something that makes you proud, and something that people believe about you, but it's not true. So we're going to do probably about 8 to about 10 minutes in small groups, since it's so many of us. And if you could break us out, Laura, I'd appreciate that.
Great, we're gonna just automatically assign you, so you
Okay.
won't get to choose.
All right.
You may have to say join though.
Yeah, you have to put it stop and join. So we'll see you in just a little bit. So that gave us a little bit of time, which we could spend a lot more time, I'm sure. But it gave us a little bit of time to think about who we are and whose we are and where we come from. And every time we go into a home, the parent already has their set of beliefs and their culture, and we definitely bring them. So we've got two things going on at one time that we have to work together. Even if we have some aspects that are the same, we still have two things that are going on that we have to figure out as visitors. Is it everybody's back then, Laura? We're good?
Yes,
Okay.
make sure everyone is.
Okay, yeah. Okay, we're all good?
Yep, go ahead.
Yeah. So if we think, when we think about cultural responsiveness in home visiting, in my mind, it's that strength-based approach where we build on relationships with them, where we have that respect. And we also keep in mind that we have the appreciation of the role of culture in a child's learning and development. So we can't really pull that out. We have to keep all of those things in mind. So we want to be able to enter into that family home with a non-judgmental attitude and view the home through the eyes of the family that's living there. And that sounds so good. We can all say that, and we can say, this is what we're going to do. But that really can be very hard. And sometimes it's hard because of our own implicit bias. And that's what we really want to challenge and think about today, and to get us all started. I want to read this quote, and I'm going to read this to you so I don't get it wrong in any kind of way. But Nikki Williams Rucker, she's an educational consultant. She does work for Edutopia and does different articles. And she looks at it this way for us to get started. The first step in being culturally responsive is to do an internal audit. That's the right thing. Yes, that's right, an audit. Truly digging deep inside of ourselves and recognizing and naming those things we don't want to look at or talk about. The experiences we've had along our journey in life have formed stereotypes, which have then turned into implicit bias. So to really understand our families and to really serve them in a way that is culturally appropriate and responsible and respectful, all of those things, we have to start within. We have to look at our own selves first. And that can be kind of hard, looking in the mirror in that way. It's that first step. We want to take that inside out approach. And that's what all of this should be about. where we are focusing on ourselves and our reflection, and then we're exploring our own personal understandings and the values that we have. It's so ingrained in us, it's so part of us. We don't talk about it or think about it. And that's when we had the questions. I wanted some time for you to kind of even just think about, okay, so this isn't something I go around thinking about all day, but this is really what we need to be able to understand as we walk into the homes. So unconscious thought brought to a conscious level can help us identify what influences our thinking. Because we're always thinking, we're always just moving forward, and we don't really take that time to say, okay, why do I think like this? Or is this something that I need to challenge myself on? So this is how we want to understand our own culture in terms of bias. So simply put, and this is not simple in any kind of way, but simply put, it refers to the attitudes and the stereotypes that affect our understanding, our actions, the decisions we make in an unconscious manner. These biases can be negative, they can be positive, and they're activated involuntarily. And that's the hard part. and then we're not really aware of what we think. We just do. We just move forward. And that means that we might not even see what we're looking at in terms of bias. We just know this is how we think, this is what we do. So we're looking at it in that way. But all of us have those biases. Every last one of us have some kind of prejudice as a result of our experiences. And they're different because of our experiences. We don't have those same experiences. And those biases can actually influence how we react when we're dealing with either unfamiliar people, familiar people too, or different situations. And those automatic association stereotypes can influence how we connect with the families as when we're doing home visiting, and we can respond in a way that is biased and prejudiced and not even really be aware of it. And I want to kind of look at that little corner over there where it says develops across the lifespan. That's exactly what it does. We hear all these messages. We hear direct messages, we hear indirect messages. The media is killing us right now. So we have all of these things that are hitting us to make us think about, to make us understand life through this implicit bias and through stereotypes. If we can show, this is a quick video that really just gives us another way of looking at it. I'll stop sharing, Laura, and you ready?
What are you thinking about? No, really, what are you thinking about? In fact, how often do you even think about what you are thinking? Neuroscience tells us we have between 35 and 48 thoughts per minute, which translates to 50,000 to 70,000 thoughts per day. These thoughts guide our behaviors throughout the day, including choices about how we go to work, what we listen to on the radio, what are we going to have for lunch, who do we speak to on our way to lunch, etc. Perhaps what's most amazing is that these thoughts, as they guide our behaviors, do it without us even knowing it. In other words, we're often operating on cruise control. Sometimes that works out well. Other times, our thoughts can have negative and unintended consequences. And that's what we're going to spend the next few minutes exploring. Hi, I'm Dr. Brenda J. Allen, professor of communication and author of the book Difference Matters, Communicating Social Identity. As a professor of communication, looking at difference matters through my teaching, research, consultations, and engaging with others in a wide variety of contexts, I've been especially excited at the newer developments of looking at how our brains influence ways that we communicate. Implicit bias is a psychological term that refers to ways that our unconscious and automatic thoughts can influence our behaviors. Sometimes our unconscious thoughts are about other people. Now, we've been taught that some groups are superior and some are inferior, and those unconscious thoughts about those people can lead us to what I call thinking under the influence. When we are not aware that we're thinking under the influence, or TUI, we may make unfair decisions in favor of or against someone based only on their group identity because of stereotypes about their group. TUI, left unchecked, can inhibit including others, which can then deny us the richness that diversity brings to our lives. Research about implicit bias suggests that employers may be thinking under the influence when they look at resumes. For example, as they look at names, they may associate them with gender, race, nationality, and unconsciously make decisions for members of the dominant group and not for those for the non-dominant group. We can catch ourselves and others thinking under the influence by being mindful as we interact with others. We should pay attention to our thoughts and our feelings. We can be aware of when we realize that we've assumed something negative about somebody based on that person's identity. That's a sign of TUI. For example, I was once on a panel with a wheelchair user who has a hearing impairment. As she was presenting, she made several witty comments that had us all laughing. I realized that I was TUI because I assumed that she would have a gloom and doom attitude because of her disabilities. If we want to work and learn and live and play in places that are equitable, we must be aware of how we TUI. So let's keep the dialogue going about thinking under the influence.
Okay, thank you, Lauren. Okay, and that's what I'd like for us to do right now. I'd like for us to keep that conversation going. And if we could break out one more time, because I know our time is almost up, but if we can break out one more time, and I would like for you to think about, how do you recognize your own implicit bias? In the video we just saw, and the example she used with the wheelchair user, and that I'm sure we've all felt that way at some time or another in situations like that. But most important that I'd like for you to think about is, how can that implicit bias that we carry around affect home visiting outcomes for families and children? That's probably the most important question for us to just, to really think through today. Because we know that, as she said, thinking under the influence, I really liked that. But how does that affect our outcomes? We're always about, we want positive outcomes. We want to be able to say we have accomplished this and this and that and these goals with our families and children. But if we let implicit bias get in the way, it could really make a difference in that outcome for that family. Sometimes people can see our bias much easier than we can see it ourselves. And we don't necessarily want to see it because we think how we think is the right way, right? But we also want to think about how do we recognize it when it happens to us? How do we know? And then what can we do with it? So let's see, what's our time? Oh, I guess we better do 10 minutes again so we can have a little bit of time for you at the end. Okay, so Laura's going to put us in breakout rooms again. All right. I hope you had a chance to share. We had a good discussion for both, but I want to add this in before we move on that I thought was really important. Molly in our group said that this takes practice. And I think it really takes a lot of practice. And even when you're good and old like me, it still takes practice. I think that that was really an important message that she shared with us, is that, you know, you want to make sure you're not carrying in something that's just you. But you want to make sure you're listening to them. But it does take practice, because who we are is invisible to ourselves, and that's our own stuff. So we have just a few quick minutes. Does anybody want to share that wisdom? But Molly certainly shared it for us in saying that this takes practice. And I can't see hands, so just shout it out. So it's all quiet. Can you see better than me, Laura?
I don't see any hands raised,
Okay, all
but
right.
but I do think if I could just add to that, one of the things that I think about in this is a lot of times we're not comfortable letting people know when we are uncomfortable, and even saying, you know, I don't know a lot about what your cultural goals are, your goals are for your children, or how you want culture to be a part of your upbringing. Those are hard things for people to talk about, because we don't generally lead in that way in Minnesota.
Yeah. Yeah, and that's true when you added the Minnesota piece on there. That's very true. But I do think it's hard, and that's why we really want to be able to recognize our in ourselves, because parenting practices are cultural. You do what you know, you do what you learned, you do what your grandma did. You know, that's generational culture, and for us to say, oh no, that's not the way you do this. You know, we had to be careful. We may disagree, but we just had to be careful. So, you know, because our interpretation of situations is different, and it's really based on who we are. And that can be very different. We also talked about young parents in our group, and that can be very different than that of young parents. So we just want to make sure that we understand that parenting practices are rooted in culture. And think about it. You know, what parents teach their children is all the things that they need to know, how they express joy, how they get mad. A gender identity is in there, those socialization patterns. All of those things are what parents automatically do, but they're also all the things that when we go in as a home visitor, that we're going in there to talk about. We're going in there to talk to them about social emotional development, and you know, how, and communication and language. So we're already set up. We're already set up as a home visitor. That is going to be more challenging than just, here, this is what I think, and this is what I do, and this is what you should do too. So it's challenging. And if you think about some of those cultural influences that lead to the bias that we all have, language certainly can, we know that. Ethical concepts of what's right and what's wrong. You know, think about how deep that is. What might be right for you might be wrong for them. We certainly see how that's working in our society right now. The other thing we see a lot of is intentional and unintentional ethnic or racial bias. Racial bias is huge. We cannot overlook that, and we need to talk about that. Our religious beliefs and understanding, and even who we are sexually attracted to. All of those things are already on the table for where we can be biased in how we feel. So it's just about being very careful in what we do. We want to keep in mind that because of that cultural values, our bias can interfere in how we think about parents parenting. And I don't know if those two words are supposed to go like that together or not, but that's really what it is, that it may interfere in how we think. And one thing we talked about in our small group was our young parents getting pregnant, things like that. You know, we might think, oh, no, you know, I wouldn't have but one, or, you know, we don't want to have any more children because, but that might be very different for a family and might be very different for someone else. So we don't want to let this bias interfere with how we think about parents parenting. I want to add this, and I know our time is up, but I just wanted to throw this in. So when we go on to our next series and what we're doing next in terms of training, is that we make sure we talk about how we communicate, because language is really the voice of a person's culture, because that's what comes out. That's who you are. Renelle talked about that they in our small group, she talked about that they practice what kind of faces, how your facial face looks when people say anything. And I know mine is not, I know I'm like, what? But you know, we have to think about that. And that's one of the ways that we communicate with people. But we always we can observe too how families communicate with each other. That's part of that, keeping your head on a swivel when you're in a home visit and listening and observing. Because once we learn their style and what's comfortable with them, both verbally and non-verbally, we got to keep that non-verbal in there because that is huge. Then we can know where we can start. And if we can look at a parent's body language and get information on how they interact with their child and go from there. So I want to keep that in mind too. And that's really a whole nother, a whole nother conversation, but it's an important conversation for us to think about because language is the voice of a person's culture. So just these things to remember. And we will continue our conversation. And I wish I was with you all. I wish we were face to face so we could just have some real good sit down conversations, but not yet, almost. That we don't have to agree with all of the behaviors that are expressed by our families. You know, I don't want us to take it all the way to the other side and agree, because sometimes what a person may do culturally may not be healthy. And you all can think of those kind of things right away. So what they can say, well, this is what we've always done, or I grew up doing this and I'm okay. Sometimes they're just not healthy. So we want to think about that. We don't have to say that everything that happens is right, because if it's hurting a child, you know, that we have to have that line. But we want to think about that too. So we're not going to always agree. We're just not. But we might want to take time to figure out what's motivating that behavior. You know, I always say, what's the reason behind the behavior? And then we can have a good conversation. We want to make sure that we are aware of how implicit and unconscious bias affects that outcome. And hopefully you had a little bit of time to talk about that. We keep in mind that the role of culture in parenting that's what parenting is, it's cultural. So we want to be able to relate to that family from their perspective. And ultimately, we just all want the same thing. We all want what's best for children. And however we get there, and whatever strategies we use with families, keeping that implicit bias out, that's where we want to be. So we have a little bit of time for, not too much, I know. We have a little bit of time for questions. I know this was really fast, but keep in mind, this was just an introduction. We've got lots more coming where we can really take time and process. But we have to start somewhere. And I think just us having that little bit of time to say, okay, what are we really doing and how are we doing it can make a difference as we move on with our training.